1977 in a small British village called Greenhithe. She was an only child and went to an all-girls school where she had a lot of friends. Even as a kid, Claire was focused and determined. She dreamed of becoming one of the first female firefighters in the country. In high school, she even volunteered at charity events organized by the local fire department, helping out however she could. Still, she wanted to get a college degree before going into that line of work. In January of 1993, when she was 16, Claire was in the middle of her final exams and thinking about her future education. On January 18th, just 4 days after her birthday, Claire headed out to a friend's house. They planned to talk about college options and figure out where they might want to apply. She left home around 6 p.m., telling her mom she'd be back in about an hour and a half. But when that time came and went, there was no sign of Claire. At first, her mom thought she probably just lost track of time, maybe stayed a bit longer at her friend's place. But when the clock passed 8 p.m., she started to get worried. She called the friend's house, only to find out Claire had never shown up. Thinking maybe plans had changed, she started calling a few of Claire's other friends, but no one had seen her that night. A few minutes later, Claire's mom stepped outside and ran into a neighbor. He mentioned that something had happened a few miles away. There were ambulances and a bunch of police cars at the scene. Claire's mom was really starting to worry, so she went straight to the local police station to report her daughter missing. She gave them a full description, but instead of taking her report, the officers told her to go home. They said there'd been some kind of incident and that someone would come by to explain everything soon. A little while later, police showed up at her door and gave her the news no parent ever wants to hear. Her daughter had been found dead just hours earlier. Earlier that evening, 2 men had been driving down a road that connected a few nearby towns. As they passed by some houses, they noticed a girl kneeling on the roadside and pulled over to check on her. The moment they got a closer look, they knew something was seriously wrong. She was struggling to breathe and looked totally out of it. One of them ran to a nearby pub to call for help, while the other stayed with her. At first, he thought maybe she'd been hit by a car, since she was so close to the road. He tried to comfort her, but her condition quickly got worse. Within minutes, she stopped breathing altogether, and by the time paramedics arrived, it was already too late. Her body was taken to the medical examiner, and the results were brutal. She had been stabbed 9 times, likely with a large knife, but there were no signs of sexual assault. Meanwhile, police began examining the scene and quickly figured out where the attack had happened. Claire was likely ambushed in a narrow alleyway that ran off the main road, leading toward her friend's house. Based on the wounds, they believed the killer came at her from behind. But beyond that, there wasn't much to go on. The alley was quiet, dark, and empty. No security cameras nearby. No witnesses. No useful evidence. Still, there was one thing that stood out. According to the medical examiner, the murder weapon wasn't just any knife. It was unusually large. Too big to be something someone would just carry around in their pocket. Detectives believed the killer had brought it from home instead, already planning to use it on someone. News of the murder spread quickly through Claire's village and nearby towns. That evening, some students were still at school for exam prep sessions, and they heard about the incident on the radio. At first, no one knew the victim's name, but it didn't take long before word got out. With no solid leads, police turned to the public for help. A few people came forward, saying they'd seen a man in a light-colored coat near the road around 7 p.m. Another witness claimed they saw a man with dark curly hair walking out of the alleyway, but no one could identify either of them, even though it was a small community where most people knew each other. Based on the nature of the attack, detectives considered the possibility that the killer might have known Claire and had a personal motive. But there was also a more disturbing theory. This might not have been a one-off. They feared they could be dealing with a serial offender. In December 1988, 4 years before Claire's murder, a 27-year-old woman was attacked by an unknown man while walking home from work. Armed with a gun and a knife, he kidnapped her and drove out of town, where he tried to assault her. Then he stabbed her 5 times and left her there, apparently thinking she was dead. But somehow she survived. Despite her injuries and the freezing cold, she managed to crawl to a nearby road, where she was eventually found by a group of workers. She spent 9 days in intensive care, and doctors were able to save her life. But police were never able to track down the man who did it. And now, after Claire's murder, both detectives and locals began to wonder, what if the same person was behind both attacks? A few days later, Claire's funeral was held, and hundreds of people from the community showed up. Just before that, her parents spoke with reporters and shared that they believed the killer might visit the ceremony. Detectives thought the same thing, so they attended the service and quietly took note of every single person who showed up. But even that didn't bring them any closer to finding the person responsible. In the weeks that followed, police kept questioning locals and chasing down leads, but nothing panned out. More than 2 years went by, and it started to seem like the case would never be solved. People slowly stopped talking about what happened to Claire, until one day, everything changed. On October 17, 1995, a local woman was walking home from work when she was attacked by a man just a few hundred yards from where Claire had been stabbed. The attacker hit her with a knife, and when she fell and screamed, he just took off running. Despite her injuries, the woman survived. But once again, detectives hit a dead end. Since the attacker came from behind, she hadn't seen his face or noticed any clear features. Still, this time police caught a break. A witness came forward and said they'd seen a white Ford nearby with some pretty noticeable modifications. That detail helped investigators quickly track down the owner of the car, a local milkman named Colin. Police realized they'd spoken to Colin before right after Claire's murder. Back then, he'd called them to report seeing a man with dark hair near the crime scene. But a few weeks later, when detectives followed up with him in person, Colin's story had changed slightly. At first, he claimed he'd been driving down that road around 6:30 p.m. Now, he insisted it was closer to 5:30. Still, he had an alibi. His mother told police they'd been driving together and were already home at the time Claire was attacked. But now, there was more reason to be suspicious. Colin drove the same white Ford witnesses had seen near another attack, and he was known for always wearing a light-colored trench coat, just like the one several witnesses described seeing near both crime scenes. He also had light-colored hair, and 2 different people had reported seeing a fair-haired man near the alley where Claire was murdered. That was enough for detectives to seriously start considering him as a suspect and to get a warrant to search his home. Inside the house, police found a large knife that matched the wounds on the most recent victim, but that was just the beginning. During the search, they also uncovered a hidden journal, and what was written inside left everyone stunned. In the diary, Colin admitted that he was the one who attacked the woman back in '88. He called it his masterpiece and even rated the crime, giving it a 95% success rate. When he later found out the victim had survived, he wrote that next time he'd do better. He also wrote about trying to sneak into a care home to kill someone, but said the plan didn't work out. Even more disturbing, he mentioned that some of his friends used to jokingly call him a killer after that first attack because of how obsessed he was with knives. He also said he threatened his first victim, warning her that if she gave his description to the police, he'd hurt someone else. On top of that, Colin confessed to the 1995 stabbing. He wrote that he'd gotten angry with his girlfriend that day, convinced she was cheating on him. Fueled by rage, he drove around looking for someone to take it out on. First, he saw a man, but decided that was too risky. Then, he spotted a woman walking alone, stopped the car, and attacked her. He said he felt a wave of relief afterward and didn't care at all whether the woman lived or died. The diary also detailed his plans to commit more murders and even mentioned that he had broken into the homes of several women he knew while they were away. When police searched Colin's car, they found blood-stained clothes and a torn piece of a tie, which, as it turned out, he'd used in an attempt to strangle his first victim. That alone was more than enough to charge him in the attacks on both women. Detectives were also pretty sure he was behind Claire's murder too, and they started digging for a possible connection. It didn't take long to find one. Colin's family knew Claire's. They both spent time at the same local community center where residents would hang out and socialize. In fact, Claire had celebrated her birthday there just 4 days before she died, and Colin had been at that venue that same night. Investigators also confirmed that he showed up at her funeral. Still, they didn't have a single piece of solid evidence linking him to her murder. While Colin sat behind bars, detectives questioned him, but he denied everything. He did, however, offer up a theory. According to him, the killer might have been a guy who used to play pool with Claire at the community center. Colin said the guy left town shortly after the murder, and that the last time he saw him was at Claire's funeral. Police tracked the man down, but he didn't match any of the witness descriptions of the person seen near the crime scene. Colin, on the other hand, was a perfect match, but they still didn't have enough to make it stick. In the end, Colin was only charged in connection with the two attacks from '88 and '95. In December 1996, he pled guilty and was sentenced to 3 life terms, with the possibility of parole after just 15 years. But investigators weren't ready to let go. They kept looking for anything that could help them finally get justice for Claire. Out of all the potential suspects, Colin still made the most sense. But there were 2 major problems: a lack of physical evidence and his alibi. As you might remember, his mother had told police that she and Colin were out delivering flyers and were already home by the time Claire was killed. But here's the thing. Colin himself had called police the day after the murder and claimed to have seen a man with dark hair near the scene about an hour later. That call actually contradicted his own alibi. Based on what he told them, he would have had to have been right near the alley when Claire was attacked. That got detectives thinking. Was his mom lying to protect him? After all, she wasn't just any mom. She was a former political party advisor, just like her husband. And she also happened to be the town's sitting mayor. When police confronted the parents again, they stuck to their story, insisting their son had nothing to do with the murder. Still, detectives kept digging, and eventually, they uncovered the truth. Colin's alibi was completely made up. They found solid proof that his mother wasn't with him that evening, which meant she'd lied to protect her son. But that wasn't the only discovery. Investigators also learned something else, something just as disturbing. Turns out, Colin's father had gotten rid of a knife his son brought home after the 1995 attack. He admitted to boiling it in water, taking it apart, and disposing of the pieces just hours before police arrived with a search warrant. For that, he was sentenced to 12 months in prison. As for Colin's mother, her involvement didn't end there. Later on, she gave an interview to a local TV station and claimed it was actually her idea for her husband to get rid of the knife. She said she truly believed her son was innocent and was scared the police would try to pin someone else's crime on him. But even with everything they'd uncovered, police still didn't have enough evidence to charge Colin with Claire's murder. While he was serving time for the other attacks, detectives kept digging into his past, trying to find anything that could finally tie him to the crime. But nothing ever came of it. The only new discovery came during a routine search of his prison cell. Officers found several disturbing notes, filled with twisted and graphic fantasies about women he knew. Just like the pages from his old diary, they painted a deeply unsettling picture of his mindset. With no solid leads in Claire's case, investigators also looked at other potential suspects. One was a local man who had killed his own mother in 1994. After the murder, he left behind a note saying she had started to suspect him of being the one who murdered Claire. Another suspect was serial killer Robert Napper. He was convicted of killing 3 people, but detectives couldn't find any concrete link between him and Claire's case. From that point on, the investigation basically came to a standstill. Claire's parents were convinced Colin was the killer, and the fact that police still couldn't charge him for her murder weighed heavily on them. In 2008, Claire's mother passed away from cancer, and in 2012, her father died as well. Neither of them lived to see justice for their daughter. Then, in 2013, the case drew public attention once again when detectives made a renewed push to bring the killer to justice. They put out another appeal to the public asking for any information, and even the Prime Minister voiced support for their efforts. The tips that came in didn't lead anywhere, until one of Colin's former cellmates came forward with a story that completely changed the direction of the case. He claimed that one day, Colin had bragged about attacking a girl. According to him, Colin said he saw her at a crosswalk and something in him just snapped. That detail instantly stood out to detectives, since Claire had been using a crosswalk that led straight into the alley where she was attacked. The other 2 victims, on the other hand, had been found nowhere near crosswalks. That one clue strongly suggested Colin had been talking about Claire, or possibly another victim that police hadn't discovered. Still, detectives doubted there were any other victims, because no other similar unsolved cases had been reported in the area. After speaking with Colin's former cellmate, police secured another warrant and returned to his house, hoping to finally uncover new evidence. As expected, they didn't find anything major, but something still caught their attention. A newspaper clipping about Claire's murder, published a year after she was killed. It wasn't enough to prove guilt, but detectives decided it was time to put everything they had on the table and try to take the case to trial. By then, a new law had also come into effect in the UK. It allowed prosecutors to bring up a suspect's prior convictions in court, which could be a game changer for Claire's case. Colin was already serving time for 2 violent attacks, both strikingly similar to what happened to Claire and committed just miles from where she was killed. Now, on top of that, investigators had testimony from his former cellmate and solid proof that Colin's alibi had been faked. That was finally enough for prosecutors to move forward. On February 12, 2014, detectives announced that Colin had been officially charged with Claire's murder. The timing was no coincidence. It happened on the very same day his first parole hearing was scheduled. Instead of walking free, he stayed behind bars, and prosecutors began preparing for trial. It took nearly a year for the case to go to court. Colin pleaded not guilty, but by then, he had already admitted to attacking 2 other women, and this time, he revealed even more disturbing details. He said he started sneaking out of the house at night when he was around 19 or 20. He'd take a knife with him and wander the streets, hoping to run into someone he could kill. According to Colin, it was all about feeling powerful, feeling like he had control over someone else, because he didn't want to be seen as weak. His ex-girlfriend also testified, saying Colin started acting really strange right after Claire was murdered. At the time, she just figured he was shaken up like everyone else in town. But looking back, she realized there was more to it. When Colin was asked how he felt about women in general, he said he both loved and hated them. He admitted he struggled with low self-esteem and constantly felt worthless, which made it hard for him to trust anyone, especially women. He also revealed that he kept a collection of 20 to 30 knives at home, along with a crossbow and a few air rifles. And apparently his parents were well aware of it. Colin even admitted that he never left the house without a knife. But when it was time for his former cellmate to testify, the prosecution hit an unexpected snag. The man said he couldn't clearly remember what Colin had told him and admitted he might have been confusing the conversation with someone else. Still, he did share one strange detail. He and the other inmates used to joke about how Colin had stabbed his victims multiple times but somehow missed all their vital organs. It became a running joke, especially when they played darts. The trial also took a sudden, heartbreaking turn when Claire's cousin suffered a heart attack during one of the sessions and had to be rushed to the hospital. Later on, the prosecution called a former mayor to the stand, and he shared something interesting about Colin's mother. At the time, she was a local counselor, and because of her position, she managed to attend a closed police briefing. There, she repeatedly pressed detectives for information about a car seen near the crime scene, and demanded to know every detail. Considering she also helped her son fake an alibi, the whole thing came off as deeply suspicious. The trial lasted 5 weeks, and in December 2014, the jury reached a verdict. Colin was found guilty of murdering Claire Tiltman. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 21 years. When the verdict was read, Colin showed no emotion. He later appealed the decision, but the court rejected it, saying the evidence against him was overwhelming. So, after 26 long years, justice was finally served. In Claire's memory, local officials named a road after her, and later even renamed a street using her last name. In 2022, a new community center opened its doors, proudly bearing Claire Tiltman's name. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching. A woman was found dead in her apartment under strange and unsettling circumstances. At first, detectives thought the answer was right on the surface. But as the case unfolded, it turned into a 15-year mystery, full of twists, dead ends, and unanswered questions. And in the end, it all came down to one random twist of fate that finally revealed the truth. Pamela Chrysler was born on March 16, 1953, in Albany, Georgia. She grew up in a big family and had always wanted to help people. After finishing high school, she earned a medical degree and started working as a mental health and substance abuse counselor. Later on, Pamela went into private practice and opened her own office. Over the years, she continued helping people, and many of her clients deeply valued the role she played in their recovery. In 2002, at the age of 49, Pamela decided to move to a new city, Athens, also in Georgia. She wanted to expand her business and kept working after the move. At the time, Pamela wasn't married and didn't have children. Most of her life had been focused on her work, helping others, and supporting her family whenever she could. On August 21, 2002, residents of an apartment complex on the edge of town reported a strange smell coming from one of the buildings. Staff went to check it out and quickly traced the odor to Unit 408. No one answered the door, so they used a spare key to get inside. But the moment they opened the door, they were met with a horrifying scene. A body lying on the living room floor. So they immediately called the police. When officers arrived, they found the body of a woman. But there were no documents anywhere in the apartment to say who she was. She was only wearing underwear, which led detectives to consider sexual assault as a possible motive. But one thing stood out. Someone had covered her with a sheet, which was quite odd. They also noticed there were no signs of forced entry at the front door. However, the balcony door had been left slightly open, leading detectives to believe the killer may have come in that way. While the medical examiners worked on the body, crime scene investigators searched the apartment for clues. The living room was covered in blood, but tests later showed it all belonged to the victim. Still, in the middle of that chaos, they found one critical piece of evidence: a single drop of someone else's blood on a newspaper sitting on the kitchen counter. Tests confirmed it came from a man, but there was no match in the DNA database. The autopsy revealed that the victim had been stabbed more than 20 times. She also had multiple defensive wounds, showing she fought back hard during the attack. However, there were no signs of sexual assault, ruling out the detectives' original theory. The first priority for police was to figure out who the victim was, so they went to speak with the building manager. To their surprise, he told them the apartment was rented by a man named Richard, who, as far as anyone knew, lived there alone. Detectives started trying to track him down, and before long, they managed to reach him by phone. Richard told them he'd been in Florida on a work trip for the past few weeks. He also identified the victim. It was Pamela Chrysler. According to him, they'd met not long ago and had gone on a date, but nothing romantic ever developed. Still, they stayed in touch as friends, and when Richard had to leave town, he offered to let Pamela stay at his place for free while he was gone. He said it made him feel better knowing someone was keeping an eye on the apartment. Richard also mentioned that they'd been talking on the phone every day, until 4 days ago when she suddenly stopped answering. He thought it was strange, but figured she was just busy and didn't think much of it. Right from their first conversation with Richard, detectives started picking up some red flags. For starters, the fact that he let a woman he barely knew live in his apartment struck them as odd. On top of that, during the phone call, Richard mentioned that Pamela used to sleep with the balcony door slightly open, a detail that made investigators raise their eyebrows. They hadn't shared that information publicly, but they already suspected the killer had come in through that very door. So why did Richard bring up that specific detail out of nowhere? Shortly after speaking with the police, Richard headed back home. But on the way, he called the apartment manager and made a strange request. He asked him to cut out the section of carpet where the bloodstain had been found. He claimed he wanted to take the sample to a lab himself for testing. The manager found that so bizarre, he immediately reported it to detectives. Once Richard returned home, police brought him in for questioning, and throughout the interview he continued to act strangely. As for his out-of-town alibi, investigators weren't quick to accept it. According to the medical examiner, the body had been in the apartment for at least a few days, meaning Richard could have committed the murder and left town right after. Still, during the interview, Richard provided solid proof that he'd been in Florida well before the murder. He also gave detectives the names of coworkers and other people who could vouch for his whereabouts. After speaking with them, police confirmed that Richard had, in fact, been out of state, and it seemed highly unlikely that he could have pulled off the crime. On top of that, forensic experts compared his DNA to the drop of blood found on the newspaper, and it wasn't a match. So, despite all the odd behavior, detectives crossed Richard off their list of suspects and kept searching for new leads. Given Pamela's work with people struggling with mental health issues and addiction, detectives started to wonder if one of her clients might have attacked her. They began looking into each of them, but that line of investigation didn't go anywhere. Still, trying to figure out a motive, they also considered the possibility that it was a robbery gone wrong. Pamela's apartment was on the ground floor, and she often left her balcony door slightly open. That alone could have been enough to tempt a random thief into breaking in. They asked Richard to go through the apartment and let them know if anything valuable was missing. He took a careful look around and said that as far as he could tell, everything was still there. The only thing unaccounted for was a large vacuum cleaner. To police, this was just another strange detail. Why would a killer go through the trouble of carrying off a bulky, relatively cheap vacuum cleaner while leaving everything else behind? Still, detectives decided to check local pawn shops, hoping the killer might have tried to sell it. And that theory paid off quickly. At one of the shops, officers found Richard's vacuum. But there was a catch. There were no surveillance cameras inside or outside the building. The only lead they had was the employee who'd been working that day. He remembered a young guy, probably around 20 years old, coming in with a vacuum. Unfortunately, that was as far as it went. Every attempt to track the man down led nowhere. And once again, detectives were left with nothing. A few days later, once Richard was cleared to return to his apartment, he started chatting with his neighbors. He asked if anyone had seen someone taking a vacuum out of his place before Pamela was killed. Police had already considered the possibility that the vacuum incident might have been unrelated, that it could have been stolen earlier, and Pamela just hadn't noticed. But then Richard heard something interesting. One of his neighbors said she'd had trouble sleeping the night of the murder. At some point, she heard a noise in the hallway and looked through her peephole. That's when she saw a young man, someone she didn't recognize, rolling a vacuum cleaner out of Richard's apartment. At first, she thought about opening the door to offer help. But just as she reached for the handle, something didn't feel right. She hesitated and stayed put. As she kept watching through the peephole, she happened to crack open a soda can she'd been holding the whole time. The sound was loud enough that the man froze and stared straight at her door. He stood there for a few seconds, then grabbed the vacuum, shut the door behind him, and disappeared. Detectives were surprised, if not a little frustrated, that the woman had waited weeks to share something so important. She insisted it had simply slipped her mind, and at the time, she hadn't even considered that the man might have been the killer. Now that they had her statement, police worked with her to create a composite sketch of the suspect. When they showed it to the pawnshop employee, he confirmed that the man in the sketch looked a lot like the person who'd brought in the vacuum. Detectives released the sketch to newspapers and TV stations, hoping someone would recognize the man, but no useful tips ever came in. They kept digging for any other leads that might help identify him, but nothing panned out. Eventually, the case went cold because detectives had nothing solid to work with. Over the years, the file was reopened multiple times, but every time it led straight to a dead end. That's how things stayed for 15 years. Then, out of nowhere, the case took an unexpected turn. Detectives were notified that a new DNA profile had been added to the FBI's database, and it was a match to the drop of blood found at the crime scene. It belonged to a 30-year-old man named Abdus LaRoche. His name had never once come up in Pamela's case, but he had crossed paths with police before, though not as a suspect. When LaRoche was a child, his parents joined a religious cult run by a man named Dwight York. York was infamous for building a massive compound in Georgia for his followers, complete with an Egyptian-style pyramid and sphinx. He attracted hundreds of people there until several children, including LaRoche, came forward and accused him of serious crimes. On top of those allegations, York faced a long list of other charges, including racketeering, conspiracy, and tax fraud. In the end, he was sentenced to 135 years in prison. Years later, when LaRoche was 24, he admitted that his testimony had been made up. But that confession didn't lead to a retrial. As for LaRoche, he was never charged, since he'd been just a child when he gave that statement. What really surprised detectives was how LaRoche's DNA ended up in the system in the first place. He'd been arrested for selling bootleg movie DVDs and was given probation. Not long after, he was pulled over by a patrol officer who found a small bag of illegal substances on him. Since he was still on probation, LaRoche was arrested again, and this time a DNA sample was taken. And as soon as it hit the database, detectives saw the match to Pamela's case. With this long-awaited lead, they started digging into LaRoche's past and were stunned to learn that, at the time of the murder, he had been living in the same apartment complex as Pamela, just in a different building. He was 16 years old back then, and detectives had never spoken to him. Looking deeper, they managed to track down his old high school yearbook and compared a photo of LaRoche as a teen to the composite sketch based on the neighbor's description. The resemblance was striking. Now that detectives had a DNA match, they brought LaRoche in for questioning. At first, they played it cool, telling him they were just following up with former residents of the complex who hadn't been interviewed back in 2002. They asked if he'd ever been inside the victim's apartment, and he said no. But then they told him about the DNA evidence, his blood that had been found at the scene. That's when LaRoche changed his story. He claimed that Pamela had once paid him $40 to take out some trash from her apartment. Detectives pointed out that this didn't explain how his blood ended up on the kitchen counter. So, he changed his story again, this time saying he'd found her body, panicked, and ran off. Not long after, he shifted the story yet again, now claiming that he and Pamela had actually been in a romantic relationship, even though she was 33 years older than him. Detectives knew LaRoche was just scrambling to avoid taking a fall, but with a DNA match, they didn't actually need a confession. Still, they had to follow proper procedure before making an arrest. They got a warrant to collect a fresh DNA sample and sent the swab to the lab for final confirmation. While they waited for the results, the case took another unexpected turn. LaRoche's own brother called the FBI tip line. He said that years ago, LaRoche had actually confessed to him that he was the one who killed Pamela. According to his brother, LaRoche had told him that he had broken into Pamela's apartment in the middle of the night, planning to steal something. But while he was inside, she woke up and caught him, so he grabbed a knife and attacked her. Now, detectives had more than just a DNA match. They had a statement from LaRoche's own brother. Once the lab officially confirmed the blood at the scene belonged to LaRoche, he was arrested, and prosecutors began preparing for trial. LaRoche continued to insist he was innocent, and the prosecutor realized this case might not be as straightforward as it seemed. At the time of the murder, LaRoche was only 16, and the only physical evidence linking him to the scene was a single drop of blood. There were no fingerprints, no murder weapon, and no other physical evidence to back it up. So yeah, it was possible a jury might decide that just wasn't enough. So prosecutors offered LaRoche a deal. If he pled guilty to manslaughter and the theft of the vacuum, they'd take life in prison and the death penalty off the table. He agreed almost immediately, signed a confession, and was sentenced to 20 years behind bars. He'll be eligible for release in 2038, when he's 52. After that, he'll be under supervision for another 20 years, and if he commits even a minor offense, he'll be sent straight back to prison. Pamela's family was stunned when detectives told them about the arrest. For 15 years, they believed the case would never be solved, that they'd never know what really happened. But in the end, LaRoche, who had managed to slip through the cracks for so long, got caught over something as small as selling bootleg DVDs. Eve Carson was born on November 19, 1985, in Athens, Georgia. From a young age, she stood out as someone incredibly driven and focused. In high school, she served as vice president of the student council, volunteered at a nursing home, and a shelter for abused teens. On top of that, she worked as a congressional page and assisted in a stem cell research lab, all while still a student. After graduating high school with honors, Eve enrolled at the University of North Carolina, where she double majored in political science and biology. Her academic achievements earned her a prestigious scholarship, and she quickly became a campus leader, taking on key roles in several student organizations. But she didn't stop there. Eve continued her charity work and even taught science at an elementary school. She also traveled abroad for volunteer missions, spending a summer in Ecuador assisting doctors, studying for a semester in Cuba, and joining a research team in Egypt. Eve was, without question, one of the most exceptional students at her college. She had big dreams for the future, and she was well on her way. Even before graduating, she had already been offered a job at a major company, and was planning to start her career right after getting her diploma. In March of 2008, Eve was 22 years old and in her senior year of college. At the time, she was living in a house just off campus with a group of close friends. On the night of March 5th, around 1:30 a.m., her roommates were heading out to a party. They invited Eve to come along, but she turned them down because she had classes to prepare for and wanted to stay in and study. So her friends left without her and didn't come back until 4:30 in the morning. When they got home, something immediately felt off. The front door was wide open and the lights were still on inside. But Eve wasn't there, and neither was her car. It didn't make sense. Why would Eve leave in the middle of the night? And why would she leave the door open? Her friends tried calling her, but she didn't answer. Still, they figured maybe something had come up. Maybe she had to run out unexpectedly. So they waited, hoping she'd show up. But by the next day, there was still no sign of Eve. That's when one of her friends decided it was time to go to the police and report her missing. As soon as Eve's friend explained the situation to investigators, they told her something chilling. They had found the body of a young woman earlier that morning, but hadn't yet identified her. They showed the friend a photo of the victim, and she immediately recognized Eve. It turned out that around 5 a.m., just a short time after Eve had gone missing, police got a call from a woman who lived about a mile from Eve's house. She said she was jolted awake by the sound of gunshots, followed by a terrifying scream. Scared and unsure of what was happening, she called the police. Officers responded to the area and found the body of a young woman lying on the ground. She had no ID, no phone, nothing that could help identify her. The only thing investigators could confirm at the time was that she had been shot multiple times. After Eve's friend identified her, detectives spoke with her roommates and pieced together a rough timeline. At 1:30 a.m., she was at home studying. By 5 a.m., she was found dead just a mile away. The big question now was, how did she end up there and who was responsible? Since Eve's car was missing, detectives started to think it might have been a robbery. That theory got even stronger when they searched her room and realized her wallet and credit cards were gone too. And they weren't anywhere near the body either. The medical examiners also confirmed there were no signs of sexual assault, which helped rule out another possible motive. When police checked her phone records, they saw the last signal came from a cell tower near a highway just outside of town. But the phone itself was never found. It looked like the killer had tossed it somewhere out in the woods. Then detectives got their first real break. A car matching Eve's description had been found abandoned just a few miles from her house. The vehicle was immediately handed over to forensics for fingerprinting and DNA analysis. In the meantime, detectives uncovered something else. Forensic experts analyzed Eve's computer, the one she'd been using to study, and found that it was active until around 3:30 a.m. That meant she was still at home for at least 2 hours after her friends left for the party. Only after that did she somehow end up a mile away where her body was later found. By then, news of Eve's murder had spread across the city, and her college campus was in shock. Nearly everyone knew her. She was involved in almost every major student organization, and no one could believe she was gone. On top of the grief, fear started to set in. People were scared for their own safety, and the fact that police had no solid leads only made it worse. As a result, detectives were flooded with tips. Students called in with anything remotely suspicious trying to help. But no matter how many leads came in, none of them brought investigators any closer to solving the mystery. But soon, investigators got a key piece of information. Since it looked like the killer had taken Eve's credit cards, They pulled her transaction history, and what they found was huge. Just 18 minutes after Eve last used her computer, someone withdrew $700 from her account using 2 separate transactions. They then tried to take out more, but hit the daily limit and were denied. The ATM used for the withdrawal was located near a shopping center on the opposite side of town. Detectives immediately requested the security footage, and sure enough, they got a hit. The video showed a man sitting in Eve's car, using her card at the machine. In the back seat, there appeared to be someone else. Investigators suspected it might have been Eve, but the image quality was too poor to say for sure. Forensic specialists tried enhancing the footage to get a clearer view, but it didn't help. Meanwhile, police learned the suspect had tried to use Eve's card at several other ATMs around the city, but none of those machines had surveillance cameras. That continued until March 7th, when police got yet another alert about an attempted withdrawal. This time, the suspect had shown up at a 24-hour convenience store around 12:30 a.m. and tried to use the ATM, but Eve's bank declined the transaction. Officers rushed to the store, which was located in a nearby town, and this one actually had a working security camera. When they pulled the footage from that night, they saw someone trying to use Eve's card. But here's the twist. It wasn't the same man from the earlier ATM footage. Investigators now had to consider the possibility that more than one person was involved in Eve's murder. Either that, or the killer had given her card to someone else. They tried identifying the second suspect, but just like before, the image quality wasn't good enough to get a match. So, detectives turned to the public for help. They released both photos from the surveillance cameras to the media, hoping someone might recognize the suspects. And since almost everyone in the area had already heard about the case, the phones at the station lit up with tips. But once again, none of them brought police any closer to catching whoever had killed Eve Carson. That all changed on March 12th, when police finally got a lead that seemed promising. An anonymous caller reached out and said he recognized the man from the second surveillance video, the one from the convenience store. According to him, the guy's name was Demario Atwater. Detectives started digging into Atwater's background, and what they found was pretty alarming. At just 21 years old, he already had a long criminal record. He'd been arrested multiple times for robbery, assault, drug offenses, and more. He had done some time behind bars, but had also been released early on several occasions. They also learned that just 2 days after Eve's murder, Demario was supposed to appear in court for getting caught with a handgun while on probation. Investigators pulled up old mugshots of Atwater and compared them to the footage from the convenience store. The resemblance was undeniable. They were clearly looking at the same person. They also found out that Demario lived near that store, so detectives headed straight to his house. During questioning, Demario insisted he had nothing to do with the murder, but the surveillance footage was enough to bring him in. As police kept digging, they found out he was regularly in touch with a 17-year-old named Lawrence Lovett, who, despite his age, already had a rap sheet of his own. When detectives looked at Lawrence's mugshots, they instantly recognized him. He was definitely the one behind the wheel of Eve's car in the first ATM footage. But unlike Demario, Lawrence wasn't going down without a fight. He barricaded himself inside his house, and things escalated so fast that SWAT had to be called in. When officers finally got him into custody, he also denied having anything to do with it. So both men were booked and held in jail while they waited for trial. Since neither of them was talking, investigators focused on building their case. They pulled cell phone data, and what they found was quite interesting. On the night Eve was killed, both suspects' phones pinged off a tower near her neighborhood, even though they both lived in another city. Detectives believed that Demario and Lawrence chose Eve at random, that they were simply out looking for someone to rob, and noticed she was home alone in the middle of the night. Based on the pattern of ATM activity, it seemed they forced her to drive with them to several locations where she gave up her pen. Once they realized they couldn't get more than $700 because of the daily limit, they drove her out to a wooded area on the edge of town, and that's where they killed her. Given how brutal the crime was, prosecutors announced they'd be going after the death penalty for Demario. Lawrence's case was more complicated. Since he was a minor, the harshest sentence he could get was life in prison. but prosecutors knew the evidence they had might not be enough for a conviction on its own. So they made a strategic move. They offered DeMario a deal, plead guilty in exchange for taking the death penalty off the table. And he agreed. DeMario admitted that he and Lawrence set out that night looking to commit a robbery and make some quick cash. According to him, Lawrence called and suggested they head over to the university campus to find a victim. While driving through a neighborhood, they spotted Eve through a window in her home, and that's when they made their move. Armed with her guns, they broke in and forced her into her own car. After that, they drove to several ATMs, trying to pull out as much money as they could. The whole time, Eve was begging them to let her go. She promised she wouldn't say a word. She just wanted to go home. But they had other plans. According to DeMario, they decided to kill her because she'd seen their faces, even though they never made the slightest effort to hide them. In the end, they drove her to that deserted street and shot her multiple times using 2 guns. DeMario also said something truly heartbreaking. Right before they killed her, Eve asked them to pray with her. Instead, they coldly gunned her down. In April 2010, 2 years after the murder, DeMario was found guilty. Because of the plea deal, the judge gave him life in prison instead of the death penalty, plus another 30 years. After the verdict, DeMario turned to Eve's parents, apologized for what he'd done, and said he deserved whatever punishment he got. As for Lawrence, he refused to plead guilty, and his trial began in December 2011. Despite his lawyer's efforts to convince the jury of his innocence, DeMario's confession, combined with all the evidence, was more than enough. So Lawrence was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. But his story didn't end there. In 2013, the State Court of Appeals overturned his sentence, citing a separate precedent that ruled life without parole for juvenile offenders was too harsh and unnecessary. As a result, Lawrence was granted a new trial. This time, he was a bit more vocal than before. He told the court that everyone makes mistakes and insisted he wasn't the monster people believed him to be. Still, he showed no real remorse for what he'd done. And in the end, the judge once again sentenced him to life in prison. It's also worth noting that Lawrence was a suspect in another eerily similar case. Back in January 2008, just a few months before Eve's murder, someone broke into the apartment of a 29-year-old student and killed him. Afterward, money was withdrawn from the victim's account at several ATMs across the city. However, detectives were never able to gather enough solid evidence to tie Lawrence to that crime, so the charges were eventually dropped. Eve's case didn't just make national headlines, it led to real change. In the summer of 2008, North Carolina lawmakers passed a new law that imposed tougher penalties and stricter procedures for anyone involved in gang-related crimes. It went into effect on December 1st and applied to all crimes committed from that day forward. The law was created in direct response to what happened to Eve. At her college, a scholarship was established in her name, and a memorial garden was created on campus to honor her memory. One of Eve's close friends became a finalist on American Idol. While performing on stage, he opened up about how her death pushed him to take the leap and audition. He said that without Eve, he never would have found the courage or the drive to chase his dream. Carolyn Byington was born on May 30th, 1993, in Plainsboro, New Jersey. She lived there with her parents and older sister, and from a young age, she dreamed of seeing the world. After finishing high school, Carolyn went on to study at Lafayette College, where she took part in 2 study abroad programs, which gave her the chance to visit Japan and Germany. During college, she earned 3 bachelor's degrees in international affairs, sociology, and anthropology. After graduating in 2015, Carolyn got a job at a marketing company not far from her hometown, and she rented an apartment in Plainsboro to stay close to her family. Outside of work, she volunteered with a local youth league and stayed active in charity work. Carolyn continued working at this company, giving back to her community and traveling whenever she had the chance. On June 10, 2019, 26-year-old Carolyn decided to go home during her lunch break. She was supposed to be back at the office later that afternoon, But as time went by, there was still no sign of her. Her coworkers started getting worried and tried calling, but Carolyn didn't pick up. The whole thing seemed really out of character. Carolyn was never one to miss work, and she almost never went home during lunch. She usually stayed in the office. By early evening, their concern had turned into serious worry, and they ended up calling the police to ask them to check if everything was okay. Around 6 p.m., officers arrived at Carolyn's apartment complex and found that her front door was unlocked. When they stepped inside, they were met with a horrifying scene. Carolyn was lying on the floor, and from the amounts of blood around her, it was immediately clear she was dead. While the medical examiner began examining the body, investigators started looking for evidence and talking to potential witnesses. One neighbor told police he had heard screaming around noon. He also mentioned that afterward there were strange noises coming from Carolyn's apartment, like someone was moving furniture around, but no one reported seeing any unfamiliar faces, and the complex didn't have any security cameras inside the apartment. Police didn't find much to go on either. It looked like the killer had tried to clean the scene with bleach to cover their tracks. Most likely, the noises the neighbor heard were the killer doing exactly that. While investigators searched for security footage from nearby buildings and looked for any other possible leads, the medical examiner completed the autopsy. Carolyn had suffered multiple blows to the head, likely from fists. On top of that, she had been stabbed repeatedly in the neck, with both scissors and a screwdriver. There were no signs of sexual assault, and nothing had been stolen from the apartment. But one detail stood out to detectives. The scissors and screwdriver had come from Carolyn's own apartment. All of that helped rule out the two most common motives, robbery and sexual assault, and pointed police towards something more personal. The sheer brutality of the attack also supported that theory. It looked like whoever had done this wasn't just trying to kill. They were full of rage. Police began interviewing Carolyn's family and friends, but no one could think of a single person who might have wanted to hurt her. They all described her as kind, easygoing, and completely non-confrontational. She wasn't in a relationship at the time, and she didn't have any problematic exes who might have held a grudge. Then detectives turned to her coworkers, and that's when things got interesting. They learned that on the same day Carolyn left the office for lunch, another employee did too. A 30-year-old man named Kenneth Saul. On its own, that didn't raise any red flags. But what caught their attention was the fact that Kenneth didn't come back to work until late in the day. Their manager told police that Kenneth had called to say he was having car trouble and needed to stop by a repair shop. But later the manager checked and found out Kenneth had never actually gone to the place he mentioned. Other coworkers had noticed a few strange things too. When Kenneth returned to the office, he seemed nervous, and he had scratches on his hands at one point during a casual conversation. He even asked if police could arrest someone based only on circumstantial evidence. Police were definitely intrigued by everything they heard and decided to take a closer look at Kenneth. He worked as an accountant, was married, and had recently become a father. His daughter had been born just a year earlier. He had no criminal record, and on the surface, he didn't seem like someone who fit the profile of a killer. Still, detectives couldn't ignore all the red flags and went to speak with him. Kenneth repeated the same story he told his boss, that he'd left work during lunch to get his car fixed at a repair shop. But when detectives asked him for a receipt or any kind of proof, he couldn't provide anything. Later, Kenneth changed his story. He claimed he hadn't gone to a repair shop at all. Instead, he said he'd fixed the car himself in a nearby park. That shift in his story didn't sit well with investigators. For one, the fact that he changed his account at all raised suspicions. And more importantly, Kenneth was an accountant. Not exactly the type of person you'd expect to handle serious car repairs on his own instead of going to a mechanic. Still, Kenneth kept denying any involvement in the murder, and police didn't yet have enough evidence to arrest him. But sometime later, they came across something interesting. While reviewing surveillance footage from nearby buildings, they also pulled dashcam footage from a patrol car that had passed through the area shortly after noon. On the footage, they spotted Kenneth's car, and that completely contradicted his story. Carolyn's apartment complex was located in another town, about 6 miles from the office. Kenneth had claimed he was fixing his car in a park near work, but the footage clearly placed him near her home. Even though this was still considered circumstantial evidence, it strengthened the case against him. Another reason to suspect Kenneth came from the autopsy. Medical examiners had found traces of skin under Carolyn's fingernails, indicating she scratched her attacker during the struggle. And Kenneth just so happened to have fresh scratches on his hands, ones he couldn't explain. The only problem was that the biological material recovered wasn't enough to create a full DNA profile. Despite the setback, police collected a DNA sample from Kenneth and sent it to the lab. The results came back inconclusive. Experts couldn't definitively match the DNA found under Carolyn's fingerprints to him, but they couldn't rule him out either. It wasn't enough to prove anything, but it was enough to keep him in the spotlight. By this point, detectives were almost certain Kenneth was responsible. Over the next few weeks, they kept searching for more evidence, but nothing new came up. Eventually, they consulted with a district attorney, and together, they decided that all the circumstantial evidence might be enough to hold up in court. So, 2 months after Carolyn's murder, police arrested Kenneth and placed him in jail while he waited for trial. And that's when the case took an unexpected turn. As detectives continued building their case, they received a letter from the jail, from none other than Kenneth's cellmate, and what he had to say shocked everyone working on this case. According to the inmate, Kenneth had offered him $15,000 to commit a murder after he got out of jail, and the plan was chillingly specific. The victim had to be a random woman between 25 and 30 years old, and the weapon had to be a screwdriver and a pair of scissors. Kenneth even told him to stab her in the neck and to clean the scene with bleach afterward. Detectives had no doubt the cellmate was telling the truth, because at that point the specific details of Carolyn's murder hadn't been released to the public. Only the killer could have known exactly what had been used to attack her, and how the crime scene had been cleaned. It seemed Kenneth's plan was to make it look like there was a serial killer targeting young women in the same way Carolyn had been murdered. And since he was already behind bars when the second attack would happen, he figured police would stop suspecting him. But that wasn't all. Kenneth also pitched a second plan to his cellmate, one that was even more bizarre than the first. He said the cellmate could either kill the lead detective on the case or one of the people police had interviewed during the investigation into Carolyn's murder. If he went with the second option, Kenneth told him to stage the scene to make it look like the person had done it themselves, and to leave a note on the body confessing to Carolyn's murder. The hope was that police would believe the murdered person had killed Carolyn and dropped the charges against Kenneth, letting him walk free. As for the idea of killing the detective, it wasn't entirely clear what Kenneth expected to happen, but it seemed he thought that without the lead investigator, the whole case would just fall apart. On top of that, Kenneth even gave his cellmate tips on how to avoid getting caught after the murder, all while completely ignoring the fact that he himself had been arrested almost immediately. The whole plan was so far-fetched, it sounded like something a child would come up with. But Kenneth was dead serious. He truly believed this would get him out. After learning all this, detectives asked the inmate to wear a wire and bring it all up in conversation with Kenneth. He agreed, and it wasn't long before detectives had Kenneth on tape, casually talking about arranging multiple murders. That same day, prison staff searched Kenneth's cell and found several handwritten notes confessing to Carolyn's murder. The idea was to plant them next to the body of whoever his cellmate was supposed to kill, just like Kenneth had planned. He wrote the notes himself, thinking no one would even bother to compare the handwriting. With that, Kenneth had not only handed investigators even more evidence tying him to Carolyn's murder, but he'd also racked up additional charges for conspiracy to commit murder. And yet, even with all the disturbing things they'd uncovered, detectives still had no clue why Kenneth had killed Carolyn in the first place. Eventually, though, they got their answer, and it was something no one saw coming. Kenneth remained in jail for several years, and in November 2022, 3 years after his arrest, prosecutors decided to offer him a deal. Despite the mountain of circumstantial evidence, they still didn't have a definitive DNA match, fingerprints, or any rock-solid physical proof tying him to the scene, which made the upcoming trial a risky one. So they decided to offer Kenneth a deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he would have to admit to the murder, and Kenneth agreed. He told investigators that he started working at the company back in 2016, 3 years before the murder. That's where he met Carolyn, and over time, he began to develop romantic feelings for her, despite the fact that he was married. But Carolyn wasn't interested, and she made that perfectly clear. Still, Kenneth wasn't willing to accept that. He kept those feelings to himself, at least on the surface. But beneath it all, he was slowly becoming obsessed. Kenneth never bothered her or made any overt moves. To most people, it looked like he had simply let it go. But behind the scenes, his obsession with Carolyn was growing stronger by the day. And that quiet fixation eventually spiraled into full-blown stalking. At some point, Kenneth secretly took Carolyn's house keys and made a copy, then slipped the original back without her ever noticing. From that moment on, he began letting himself into her apartment whenever she wasn't home, usually during his lunch breaks. But it didn't stop there. Eventually, he went even further and set up hidden cameras inside her apartment so he could watch her. And Carolyn had no idea. Over the next few months, Kenneth kept returning to her apartment to check on the hidden cameras. And on June 10th, he went back again during his lunch break. What he didn't realize was that Carolyn had also decided to head home that day, and because he'd left the office early, he had no idea. Kenneth was used to Carolyn spending her lunch breaks at work, so her unexpected return completely caught him off guard. According to his confession, he was inside the apartment when he suddenly heard a key turning in the lock. He quickly hid just out of view behind the front door, and when Carolyn walked in, he realized he had nowhere to run. Knowing she was about to see him, Kenneth attacked, slamming her to the floor and hitting her in the head several times. Then he grabbed a pair of scissors and a screwdriver from her things and started stabbing her, mostly in the neck area. When she was dead, Kenneth tried to clean up the scene with bleach, but there was just too much blood to get rid of. So he grabbed all the hidden cameras, fled the apartment, and later returned to the office like nothing had happened. In January 2023, Kenneth was sentenced to 45 years in prison for the murder, along with an additional 10 years for conspiracy to commit murder for his attempt to pay a fellow inmate to carry out more killings. Before the sentencing, Kenneth gave a final speech in court, apologizing to Carolyn's family. He said, "I'm sorry every day for my choices. If there was any way I could take back things that I've done, I would without any question. I regret immensely the pain I have caused you all. There are no words big enough to describe the atrocities I've done or the misery I've brought on you." He also apologized to his own family who were present in the courtroom. "I'm sorry for the way I am and that I've hidden it from you for so long, my entire life. The facade I put up kept you from seeing any warning signs. I can only imagine the pain I've caused from the shock of learning the truth." Still, many people involved in the case questioned the sincerity of Kenneth's remorse. Not only had he brutally killed Carolyn just to avoid being exposed, but he was also willing to pay his cellmate to murder innocent people, all in a desperate attempt to escape responsibility for his own crime. As for Kenneth's wife, she had absolutely no idea what he'd been doing behind her back, and she filed for divorce shortly after his arrest. Despite his supposed remorse, Kenneth tried to appeal his sentence almost immediately after it was handed down. He argued that some of the evidence had been obtained in violation of his constitutional rights and should have been thrown out of the case. But in late 2024, the court rejected his appeal, finding no legal issues with how the investigation had been handled, so the original sentence was upheld. At this point, there's little doubt that Kenneth Saul will spend the rest of his life behind bars.